So I think we are going to get started. Good afternoon, everybody. And Steve, just unmute yourself.
I believe I am unmuted.
You're unmuted. All right. So good afternoon, everybody. We're excited for our Espresso with Carlo today to have a great New Yorker, a true leader in many things in New York. And Steve, I'm not going to read your bio. The people I'm looking at who's on, everybody knows you and has worked with you. As you know, Steve served as a former secretary to Governor Cuomo. Steve, were you the first secretary to the governor?
I was indeed.
You wrote the playbook on being secretary to the governor. He's had a stellar career in the legal and government and so many different things. I worked with Steve for about 8 months recently, and that's how we got to know each other a little better when we came up with, and I see some of our friends who are on the BQE panel are on here, Hank Gutman, Denise Richardson, a few more are watching, to put together a plan to redevelop the BQE. And I think most importantly is after this COVID pandemic hit, the governor chose wisely in picking Steve and Bill Mulroot to co-chair the state reopening advisory panel, which I'm honored to serve on. And I think, Steve, you know, we're going to turn it over to you to say a few words, and I'll ask some questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. But really, thank you. I know you have a real day job that you have to do and a life, and now we've added to this additional work for you. But thank you for all that you're doing.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I should thank you for the work you did on the BQE task force and Hank and Denise, who were just extraordinary in that effort, which now seems like it was a decade ago. And it sort of points out the bigger reality, which is we're going to have to get back to things like that. The last 3 months or so, Bill Mulrow and I were asked to get involved early on in the restart. I think one of the most interesting things about Governor Cuomo when this all began was you saw a kind of extraordinary leadership. But part of what people didn't see was a realization that he had that while they were dealing with the crisis as it was unfolding, and this was, you know, in the days when the numbers were ratcheting up day after day after day, when the real crisis was about, can we get enough ventilators? Do we have enough hospital beds? What are the ICU admission rates? At the same time, the governor took time to say, look, we need to figure out what a restart looks like, because we're going to get through this crisis. And once we're through this crisis, there's going to be a lot of work that needs to begin. And that is not just one phase. The phase has become a loaded term. So there are 4 phases to start. But the notion really was that we really needed a plan to get people back to work, what that looked like in a COVID-19 era, because the virus is not going away until there is a vaccine. People have to behave in a cautious way until not only there's a vaccine, but until there are antivirals that actually work. And so the notion was, well, what is getting back to work look like? And then there's a broader question, which we're now really beginning to think about, which is, what do we do? What can we do to really re-energize the New York economy and make sure that New York comes back as strong as it was, if not better? And in the midst of all of this, because life isn't complicated enough, we really are, and it's been a long time coming, and you say, maybe some good can come out of a crisis. We're also at a moment of reckoning with some historical flaws and historical ills that have plagued, it's not New York, it's plagued the nation for literally hundreds of years. So, I'm glad that I have some role to play. Frankly, I wish I had more hours in the day. I do have a day job, but in truth, I think, those of us who are committed to this city and this state, Carlo, you are the finest example of that. There are many people on this call who are terrific examples of that. you know, this city has, and this state has times when people really need to pitch in, and to be willing to serve the overall enterprise and the needs of New Yorkers across this state. And sort of sitting at your desk or sitting at home and not getting involved isn't the way that I think most of us were raised, and isn't the way most of us act. So, you know, I'm happy to do my part.
Thank you. And I will say Kyle Kimball also from our BQE task force joined. And Steve, you know, I'm not
New Yorkers who have done more than their
That's right. And I'm not going to call people out, but I am looking at who's on this call, and I think almost everybody here are people who, in one way or another, are playing a role, have played a role, and are playing a role in getting us back to business. You know, I think, look, this has been an important week, at least for our industry, for the building industry. Phase one happened a few days ago. On Monday, I put my mask on and went to tour the Delta terminal with our friends at Delta at LaGuardia. And, you know, next door, the finishing touches were happening on the governor's announcement today. And I think the governor said it today, that this is a moment where we can't go backwards. We have to move forward. And it's a moment where New York has to lead on grand scale projects and building. He obviously has, you know, while everyone's talking about infrastructure across the country, Andrew Cuomo has actually made infrastructure happen in New York State. Our industry has benefited a great deal from that. I know Gary LaBarbera is on the call. Obviously, Gary, you've played a role with the governor in ensuring that these projects happen. So, Steve, phase one for New York City. Phase 2 and 3 are happening across the state. What are you seeing? What's going right? What's not going right?
Well, first of all, where it's going right, it is because there has been concerted and collective action. So in the construction industries, in truth, it's probably the best example of it. I mean, and Gary was right there, as was Rebney. I mean, I had, you know, a dozen calls with whether it was Rob Spire or Bill Rudin or Gary or other people associated with both the trades and with Rebney. And so what you had in construction, and the reason why it's going well, is the plan that was put out by the governor's office, the one that now governs construction in phase one, was really a plan that those people had a hand in writing. You know, the proposition always was that a bunch of folks, whether they were, you know, the team from BCG, who were the consultants who were working on it, or the folks in the governor's office, Simonita Sabatic or Robert Mojica, or Sandra Beatty, or me and Bill Mulrow. In truth, what do we know about what goes on a construction site? You know, I learned that thing that goes up and down is actually a lift, not an elevator. And so part of the way it's worked well is to get the folks who really know and have them design the plan or look at the plan that you're trying to design and give you real input. So I think what has happened here is that when it comes to construction, we actually ended up way ahead of a lot of other industries because that team is used to working together. It works together for all sorts of reasons, having to do with, I think, why the governor's administration has been successful when it comes to infrastructure and building. I mean, there really is a sense of collaboration and collegiality that would, if it existed everywhere, would be a much better place. But frankly, some of the issues that arise end up being a little more difficult to get to. And that if you think about a restaurant, what the back of a restaurant looks like, what the front of a restaurant looks like, they tend to be more difficult to figure out what general rules will work so that you have an economically viable operation. You know, it's all well and good to say you can come back with a face mask and 50%, but a lot of the restaurants will say, well, that doesn't make us a viable enterprise. And by the way, in the back of the house, what does 50% mean? Well, it can't be 50%. And so I think we have been I don't want to say less good, but it has been more work to get it right when you're dealing with businesses that are not necessarily more complex, but where there are greater varieties that present themselves. Broadway presents the same issues for all the reasons everybody can imagine. So I think we've all collectively done a good job. I think that phase one really did prove to be a testing ground. I think that getting places into the right phase is always going to be a work in progress. We've moved, outdoor restaurants as an idea from being part of restaurants to being its own separate thing. We've done that in a number of areas. Higher ed originally, the question was, well, higher ed is phase 4. What does that mean? Well, higher ed, the executive staff, higher ed, the administrative staff is now in phase 2. And that was because we listened to what they had to say.
Can you repeat that, Steve? Because you and I have talked a little bit this week about higher ed. I've gotten a lot of emails from our education committee members, but I think that's an important point you just made.
Yeah, and let me just explain. I mean, I think most people on this know, we say higher ed as if it's this sort of monolithic entity and that it's all the same. Higher ed in this state is everything from a very small community college to a rural liberal arts school that maybe have less than 1,000 students to NYU and Columbia and SUNY Buffalo. It's not one thing, and it's also not one thing in the sense that it's not all classrooms. There is a whole lot of research work going on in the university system, and so early on, because you tend to get started in a project like this by painting with a broad brush, you say colleges and universities are phase 4. Why? Students coming together, big group activities. It was at a time when I think we knew less about how this disease responds and the effectiveness of simple things like wearing a face mask. But you almost immediately hear a series of questions that are the right ones, which is, well, you say phase 4. What about our administrative offices? Our administrative offices are no different than any other office. Why would our office, where we're planning for a fall, hopefully, why would we be shut down until conceivably the late summer, the fall? Absolutely right. And so there was immediately a quick tweak. The next question I got, I think it was from Mary Beth Labate, who is the head of the organization that represents colleges and universities. She said, what about research? She said, we have all sorts of research going on. Why would that be in phase 4? It tends to be fairly small, fairly discreet. It's a sophisticated enterprise. And most importantly, they receive a lot of federal funding. And we will put our federal funding at risk if we are not able to begin opening up our research facilities until the fall. And by the way, that's what other states are doing. And we are competing for funding for with those other colleges and universities. So we made that change. And so what's now happened is that a lot of what we would think of as the skeleton and the infrastructure of higher ed is actually in phase 2. The university and colleges having residential life, it remains in phase 4, but there will be a lot more forthcoming about what those guidelines looks like and how they can begin to prepare. So I think this will end up being this week, and then early next week will be a critical period in letting all of those institutions know what they're going to need to do to prepare. But I should say, much like the construction industry, I am unaware of any college or university that already doesn't have a plan in hand, hasn't thought this through, isn't in touch with their faculty, and isn't in touch with their student bodies.
I agree. And I think, the construction industry, just to pivot back to that, I think has shown once again that in times of crisis, it is building New York that gets us out of the crisis in many ways. So we started phase 1 a couple of days ago, New York City. How do you think we're doing? We're 4 days into it.
I think it's going great. I think that the bulk of what is starting in New York is construction. There's manufacturing, but it is not as visible, and there isn't as much of it as there is construction. We have, also some other things that are opening up. But for the most part, I can tell you, I've seen construction coming back online, and what I think is happening is that the construction trades and the managers are doing a great job. And I do think that, as you said, you want to understand what runs this city. Wall Street ends up being important. There are a lot of community businesses that end up being important, and construction, and in particular infrastructure, end up being critical. And before all of this happened, and you and I and Hank talked about this at length, we were at what was very much an inflection point, that we have an infrastructure that really has made the city and the state what it is. And between the highways, the airports, the bus terminal, the tunnels, the bridges, the system is dependent upon people being able to move in and out, and not to mention the subway systems and the rail systems generally. And that, through no one's real fault, there has been just over the life cycle of these pieces of infrastructure, tremendous deterioration. I'm involved with the Gateway Development Project.
I was just going to ask you, tell us another one of your many roles, but tell us what you're doing with Gateway.
Yeah, so I mean, Gateway in many ways is a story that's all too familiar, which is we have a system, the North River tunnels, which is the tunnels we all go through when we take a train in or out of Manhattan, going west or anywhere in the northern corridor, frankly, anywhere but New Jersey. You end up in those tunnels, and those tunnels, there are only two. And there's one going in and there's one going out. And if there's a delay, or if there's a failure, or if there is a stuck train, it ripples throughout the Northeast. It actually flows across the country. And so the notion was, a number of years ago, that the most sensible thing to do was to create and build two new tubes to lessen the capacity, to move away from the notion of a single chokehold, and to get federal funding. And to say it is almost self-evident. Of course you get federal funding. The tunnel itself is an instrumentality of interstate commerce. It goes between two states, and it is used by a dozen states. And we had actually had an understanding with the Obama administration. And unfortunately, that administration has passed from the scene, and the agreement unraveled. And so we are now in a position where we are waiting and hoping that we get a federal partner here to step up. The president of all people, Donald Trump, was quoted, I think 4 weeks ago, in saying that it was the most critical infrastructure project on the Northeast. Arguably, I think it's in the whole country, and that he saw no reason why there wouldn't be $30 billion forthcoming for the project. Unfortunately, there isn't $30 billion forthcoming for the project. So working through all of that, but that is, it is an indication of generally the problems we're facing in this region. Part of it is the realities of the political environment that these decisions get made in. Part of it is that a lot of things, BQE and the triple cantilever among them, the L train, which has now been effectively restored, other East River tunnels, the bridges, that they all are in critical need at the same time. It's interesting. The governor has gotten a tremendous amount done, but it really is a prelude to the work that needs to be done. He's done remarkable work. They just opened LaGuardia. You've got the Mario Cuomo Bridge. You've got the Kosciuszko Bridge, which I thought never in my lifetime would I see a new bridge there.
I wrote, it's so funny talking about the Kosciuszko Bridge. As someone who uses that bridge a lot, I wrote over it again on Saturday, and it truly has made a remarkable difference on someone's driving experience through the city. It really has. It tells you what leadership and vision on infrastructure. And the other one is the Goethals Bridge.
Yeah.
That thing, just getting into Staten Island, has changed. It's completely changed the way you move now.
Yeah, and look, this is the reality of infrastructure, which is when it doesn't work, everybody suffers. And when you get it right, it almost becomes invisible. It just, you get used to it. It's what it's supposed to be.
Right.
Now, how do you pay for all of this is the hard part. But in truth, you're in an era right now, and I think we're going to be there for some time, that the best investment the federal government can make is in infrastructure projects.
Right.
They are jobs programs. They correct needed decay. They revitalize cities, which are economic engines. And so the notion that we can't embrace those across the political aisle and get this done the right way is a little baffling. I still hold out some hope. I know that you have spoken with Senator Schumer.
Yes.
I'd like to believe that he can have a partnership with those across the aisle, although, you know, we are living in truly some of the most curious political times I've seen in my life.
You know, we when I started at the Building Congress a few years ago, some of our members that are on joined us, but we started a true lobbying effort in Washington, D.C. We hired a D.C. lobbyist, DHC. We've done trips there. I'm down there every month. And we had one meeting with a very senior Republican senator, I will not mention his name, who said to our group, and there were about 20 of us sitting in his office, he said, there was a time in the U.S. Senate when infrastructure was the only thing that we sat down and we forgot if we were left, right, conservative, none of it meant anything. What mattered was we had to rebuild America. And he said to us, I, as a right-wing conservative Republican, understood the fiscal prudency of spending monies in cities and states where there are a lot of people. And he made a joke. He said, in my state, there aren't a lot of people, but we have rivers. So I needed money for river projects and bridge projects, but I didn't need money for mass transit and highways. That had to go to California and New York and Florida and Texas. So my hope is that the crisis that we're living in, the medical crisis, but I think equally, if not more important, the social justice crisis, that I think you said earlier, we shouldn't be surprised that it's happening because it was bound to happen. If all of that will re-engage our leadership across Washington to say, let's reinvest, let's spend money in urban centers. And I think if anyone needs a model, obviously the Governor Andrew Cuomo model is you get projects done, you move things, you get things forward. So what should we, you know, there's great people on the phone, there's organizations watching us, Steve. What should we be doing to get this clear to people across the country?
Look, I think in the first instance, you know, let's talk about the particulars, which is to the extent there are people who have relationships with, and I'll say it, Republicans in the Senate.
Yeah.
You know, and there are plenty of people I know who support Republican candidates, who are donors. Those senators need to hear that, you know, they are more than willing to come to this city and this state to fundraise. And yet it seems like they are also more than willing to pretend that they don't have a relationship with New York. They do, and we need them. And it is not something that will not, as you say, Carlo, ultimately benefit them. So in the first instance, people should be motivated to pick up the phone and to press those they know. And frankly, if you don't know somebody, but you know somebody who knows somebody, we've got to make the case for New York. The second thing is, I think we are in a period where we need a different kind of innovation, and we've seen some of it. You know, you've seen it in the way the governor approached the Tappan Zee Bridge, now the Mario Cuomo Bridge, in terms of his willingness to do design build, which is now the law that you can do design build, the willingness to do PPPs, the willingness, frankly, to look for alternative funding sources. And I think that people who have ideas that they know are good but haven't seen their day, now is your day. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean it's going to be embraced quickly. But I am happy to hear from anybody about an idea, especially if it's one that is not reliant upon state and federal funds. If you've got a better way to use bonds to build the Gateway Bridges, I'm sorry, the Gateway Tunnel, let me know. We've been looking at those things and we're considering them, but I think now is the time more than ever that bold ideas can really see the light of day, and people are willing to take some risks. And you look around this city and this state, there are all sorts of projects. I've spoken to a number of people about them. I mean, and they're things that people forget about. And, I will now engage in probably an act of heresy. You look at the bus terminal. When I was on the Port Authority, the bus terminal is controversial for all sorts of reasons, having to do with just generally the cost, the neighborhood. It is sort of the ultimate NIMBY issue. It is a technology, and there are these projects you have where you work on them, and then you have moments where you say, I'm designing something for really 10 years from now that's supposed to last for, call it, the next 60 years. I'm designing it for technology that's about to be obsolete. What am I doing? But that's the need. So, but you look at the bus terminal and you say, and there are some ideas out there. Chris Ward, if you're listening, I know you have some ideas.
Yes, he does.
And those ideas need to be heard, and you need to press, and it needs to be that people who don't get the phone call returned the first time or the second time are willing to call the third time. And I think what this region, the whole region, needs are those kind of ideas that you couldn't get done before because they were different, or they were unconventional, or they had risk. And now is the time. We need those projects.
We have a couple of people are asking about P3s, obviously model that we've seen work on different projects. Can we look at the Gateway, just use Gateway as an example? How do you see a P3 playing there? Is it something that's possible?
I'm from a world where everything is possible.
Right.
You sort of learn as you get older that the idea that you thought doesn't work, in fact, ultimately does work, and you forgot about it. Right. And so there are some complexities.
You mean the Gilligan's Island plan? That's an inside, only a few people will know that one, but go ahead.
I often find that my greatest inspiration came from episodes of Gilligan's Island I saw when I was a kid. And it turned out that with the BQE and the triple cantilever, there was an episode of Gilligan's Island, which I would commend to all of you, called A Nose by Any Other Name, that gave me a real source of insight into how to deal with the problems. And I believe it's probably available because everything's available online.
Everything
Feel free to watch it and you can thank me. But I do believe that there are some complexities with Gateway because of the nature of the partners. Figuring out how you fund it. Funding is the wrong word. It's what are the facilities costs, which are sort of the way we keep referring to tolls. Those facility charges and how they're allocated get complicated because you have Amtrak, which tends to have a high ticket price and a low number of users, and New Jersey Transit, which has a low ticket price and a high number of users. And so one of the things that makes a triple P a little complicated is, how do you pay that back? And how do you deal with the facility charges issue? And there's, I think as everybody realizes, the minute you use the word toll and not the word facility charges, that there's a whole lot of politics. Most of it, frankly, is Jersey politics, but it's still there. But look, I do think there are viable ways to get creative about how you use bond financing coupled with private partners to do that tunnel. And I think we're at a point, unless we really do have unexpected good news from the feds, that the time is right to consider those things.
Right. And look, again, there are many people on this call who are engaging in lobbying and advocacy for infrastructure money and state money from the federal government. The Building Congress, we're doing some Zoom meetings with Republican senators in the coming week or two to really continue to apply the pressure and the notion that New York is critical for the world, for the country's economy. I mean, 20% of the GDP of America is the Northeast Corridor, and it's probably more than that. The things that we are going to build here, we're sourcing from other states. And when you talk to senators from states out west and in the South, and you say, hey, by the way, we're buying some parts for X project from you, things start to change. So one of the things we've engaged in is twofold. One is to let these Republican senators across the country know that many of the larger members of the New York Building Congress have offices in your state, hire and employ thousands of people in your state. And by the way, that sewer project, that highway project, that et cetera, infrastructure project, it's being done by one of the members of the New York Building Congress. So we may be called New York Building Congress, but our reach is across America. And then when you go further and you say, and we are sourcing and hiring and doing from your states. So building in New York has a direct economic input in X state across the country. I think for all of us on this call, that becomes a critical thing. And then, of course, how to fundraise and who to call when you need a breakfast in New York. So let's not forget that as well.
Yeah, and look, the reality is there are very few small projects in New York because of the complexity. And I'm involved with the Performing Arts Center at the World Trade Center, and you look just there, which is not the largest project. It's a critical project, but not the largest. And you look at where the steel is sourced from, where the marble is sourced from,
right?
Where this is not about New York, and it began really, truly, it began with the Erie Canal, and since then, this country rises and falls on the fortunes of New York. New York tends to be a few years ahead of everybody, but if there's an economic problem in New York, it ripples throughout the country, and that's not going to change. The truth is, and the governor has spoken about it, there's a reason why more people got sick in New York faster. And it wasn't something inherent about the soil or the air or the nature of the place. It's because more people come here, and more people come here for a reason. And we are going to get back to that very soon. So I think it's incumbent upon elected officials, regardless of their party, to recognize that the responsible thing to do is find projects that are not simply pork barrel for your own constituents, but will actively help the U.S. recover. And those happen to be, in many instances, things that relate to New York.
Agreed. A couple of questions on Penn Station. And we know that obviously for, 25, 30 years, they talked about, the Moynihan Station. Governor Cuomo's actually getting it done. I'm happy to say many of our members, actually everybody working on the project is a member of the Building Congress. So that's exciting for us. But I know you've been involved in that. You've been talking about it. The governor has done a lot of work, really thinking about not just how Gateway will change, but how we make the experience of if you're coming out of a train that went through the new Gateway tunnels into Moynihan or Penn South, the new project. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on Penn Station.
Look, I think that there are really, if you think about it, several different pieces to what's going on at Penn Station. The most visionary is really Penn South, and I think the time has come for that. But the revitalization of Penn Station generally, getting Moynihan Station going, it's already started, but really bringing that to fruition, as you say, will fundamentally change the experience of all sorts of people who walk through that station every day. And it is thousands of people. You can sort of go through the history of how we ended up where we are. If there ever was a project that from inception was flawed, it's the project that led to what currently is Penn Station. I think there's an opportunity now to really correct that. I think the governor, I think the leadership at both MTA and Port Authority has a piece of it, has really done an extraordinary job of pushing that forward and figuring out the Moynihan Station piece of it. I think, though, that ultimately the major change is going to be when they get Penn South done. And I think they've made real strides on Penn South. Now, Penn South, it's not that I don't have an interest. I think Penn South works because you do the gateway tunnels. You need the gateway tunnels. But I think collectively, that set of projects is the future of of the West Side and of rail travel into and out of New York, with the exception of the trains going east to Long Island, which really are more of a regional transit system.
Right. I could talk to you about infrastructure all day, but I do want to get back because I know time is running out. We only have a few more minutes. A couple of people have asked about what should we be doing to make office workers comfortable, and to get people back to the mindset that you should go back to Manhattan to work. It's okay to get in your office building, and how do we convince people that it's okay?
I don't think there has been enough discussion. I mean, in part of the problem is that people have been, those responsible have been very much embroiled in getting through the day and getting the startup plans prepared and distributed. I think people need to hear more about what that office building is going to look like when you arrive, what changes have been made both by the building owners and managers, but also by the businesses themselves. I mean, the reality is we're not going back to 100%. The population density in those buildings is going to feel very different than it felt pre-COVID. I hear more conversations about elevators, and the reality.
So do we.
Yeah, I mean, somebody just asked me, so it's one person in an elevator, in a big building, how long is it going to take to get up to the floor? Well, no, it's not one person in an elevator. It's 50% elevator capacity. People should be wearing masks. They should be wearing masks anyway. And so I think the problems that people envision are in fact probably overblown. I think the reality is the more we learn about this disease, the more it is clear that doing some simple things to keep you safe, in fact, work. And so, look, we'll monitor what the infection rate is over the next week or two in New York City. We're going to learn soon enough. But from everything I've read and everything I've heard, you wear a mask, you wash your hands. It's highly unlikely you are going to contract the virus. And so, if it's as simple as that, and I hope it is, there really isn't a tremendous cause for concern. And by the way, just looking back at the past, month and a half, that sure seems to be the case, at least in my experience.
I think you're right. Tell us how you're seeing the regions that have gone into phase 2 and phase 3. What got them quickly from 1 to 2 to 3?
I think people behaved responsibly. I mean, look, the risk is always going to be, and you see it walking around the streets of New York City, right? I had a conversation with somebody in the governor's office about outdoor dining. I'm a big believer we should open outdoor dining sooner rather than later.
I'm with you.
Yeah, my biggest point, I had a whole bunch of sophisticated arguments for why that was. The argument now is simple. We already have outdoor dining, right? And so if you got a place serving food and the weather's nice and you're serving food as takeout and there's a bench, you now have outdoor dining. And I think we all see it. The issue really, though, is it happening safely? And you have to worry in the upstate regions that have now moved into phase 2 that people behave responsibly and that there is a tendency for people to want to go back to what was normal. And you get comfortable, you get worn down, you forget what we've been through. I've always been worried not that the city and cities generally wouldn't come back. I've been worried that they're going to come back faster than people really think, because there's a general desire to get out, to be with people. And I just think the great risk here is that people, well-meaning though they might be, move a little too fast. And I'm hoping that doesn't happen.
A couple of questions about real estate, and if you were to look into a crystal ball, how do you see the effects on the long-term real estate market in New York City? Do we still have the ability, for example, the governor talked about the Penn Station area using air rights. Do we still think that New York will do some of these grand visioning ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I have two observations. And I'm the wrong person to make observations about real estate. I was born in Brooklyn, and when I was young, we moved away, and I came back to New York City more or less staying here or close by in 1981. And it's now a long time ago. And every year, the real estate market got better consistently. And every year I said, it just can't go up any higher. And I have consistently been wrong. The one thing I have learned is that for whatever reason, New York real estate tends to recover and tends to do well over time. The other thing I know is that this is a state and a city that has always operated off of big ideas. And that has been reflected in the way government is operated. And for you to be successful, you do big things. And it helps the city. But you look at the legacy of whether it's, Al Smith or Mayor LaGuardia or FDR or the current governor. It's those big projects that really provide the legacy and really give this city both its special feel and the ability to stand above others. And I think the real estate community has been partnered with government, since the early days of this city. And I don't think there's going to be less of it. I actually think there's going to be more of it. And I think that, the thing that we all in government can do is we can make it easier by getting rid of some of the cumbersome regulations and hurdles, bureaucratic hurdles that exist. I think some of those things are necessary. I think community input is important. You can't run over the local neighborhoods. You have to get input. But I also think we make it very hard to do business, and we have to look at ways to make that easier. And I also think that overall, the building trades have done a great job of becoming more inclusive. But I also think, especially given sort of where we are in the state of the world, we all have to be mindful that now really does need to be an era where inclusiveness is at the top of the agenda.
I agree. And I think that, everybody here will be hearing more from us, at least in the building industry, on what that means and what inclusion really means moving forward. And I think it's a reckoning that we all have to come to terms with and make significant changes. I think, I was on a call this morning with some people that are helping me put this together, and we all agreed on one thing: no more reports, no more studies. We have to have action now. I think people really want to see major changes. So, if you, and I want to close in a minute, but if you think about this: Kennedy, LaGuardia, Penn Station, Penn South, Gateway, new bridges, new tunnels, BQE. I mean, there's so many things that are planned for New York. And it's not just about the project and what it looks like. It's about job creation, inclusion, community participation, rejuvenating neighborhoods, and putting people back to work. So I think we're about to embark, I believe, and I agree with the governor on this, in an era where the big projects, the grand boldness of New York is not just needed because, yeah, it's great to have, but it's needed to get us back to work and get our economy moving. So, and I know, Steve, you will be right at the head of the train, helping make that happen.
Look, I think now it's the opportunity is there, and there are so many projects that are waiting, some not even recognized, but there's an opportunity now, and I think it's up to all of us to start pushing those things forward.
Right, I agree. So any closing thoughts before I ask you one last question?
Look, I think now is a time for, everybody who is, part of your world and part of this event today, to make sure that they get involved. Now is not a time to sit and think, what could I do? Just start doing it.
I agree.
And it's, I look at the things that I haven't done in my lifetime, and I realize when moments like this come, you got to get involved somehow. And there's plenty to do. And if somebody doesn't know what there is for them to do, call me, because I'll give them something to do. I could use the help.
I have read, I think everybody on this call has read the same stories. People fleeing New York, the New York is over, how many times have reporters written that story? Is there like when you go to journalism school, is there like a reporting 101? Here's the story written about the days of New York are over, right? I mean, to me, it's okay, people will go and people will come. But the base of New York, the people who are here in the good, the bad, and the challenging days, roll up their sleeves and say, we're New Yorkers, we want it to be better. So, I want everybody listening today, and I think, Steve, you've done this in your work, and what you've really been saying in the last few months is, let's just move forward. Let's get through this crisis, get better, and be a better city. But let's move forward and build on all the great accomplishments.
Yeah, and let me just add one thing to that, because there is somebody, a very significant business leader that recently remarked, and a lot of people heard about it, that he thought the world of the city is going to change fundamentally, and that cities will cease to exist in the way we know them, and certainly New York will not exist as we've known it before. I couldn't disagree more. The history of the Western world, the history of civilization has been about people coming together. The energy that's created when people are together, the opportunities that are created when people are together. It is not lost on me that the first thing King David did when he became king and solidified his hold over my people was to found a city. And there's a lesson in that. And the cities aren't going away, and New York isn't going away. And the notion of the demise of New York City, people write it because it's easy, but people write it because they really don't understand the history of New York City, or frankly, the history of civilization.
Right, I agree. And I would say this to everybody listening: when we see those articles written, email the reporters, because we all know the reporters well. Let's give our point of view. And most importantly, let's show in our actions and how we move forward that they were totally wrong and missed the mark. So Steve, with that, how has your COVID pause been? Any good restaurants that you want to tell us you've been taken out from that we should use? Or
well, as Hank Gutman knows well, there is in my building a restaurant called Estuary, which has a little takeout operation called Ebb and Flow. And I have been swinging by Ebb and Flow quite frequently to pick up whether it's something to eat, although my wife and kids have been quite active in making sure that dinner is prepared every night. It's been sort of an interesting experience. Yeah, but Ebb and Flow has been great. They've been very supportive of the community, and there's a small restaurant a walk from us it's actually right across from the Red Hook Container Terminal, called Pepina, which is a great little unknown jewel of a restaurant that needs help making sure that they survive.
What's the name of it again?
Pepina.
Okay. Owned by some of my people, I assume.
Well, they at least represent that they are.
Okay, good. I may have to go on Saturday and make sure it's good.
You check them out.
I will. But Steve, thank you. Really, you're one of the leaders that is always there when we need something in New York, and we really thank you. You have our support. Whatever we can do to help you and the governor continue to move things forward, we're here for you.
Well, look, thank you, and thank you for all the work you do. And there are, literally dozens of people on this call who have done extraordinary things, much greater than anything I've done. And if I could thank them all personally, I would, and I'm going to try to.
Thank you. Everybody have a great day. We'll see you next week. Thanks, Steve. Thank you, everyone. Bye.